Okay, everybody, welcome to number 118 of the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series. Today's topic is Let's talk about Georgian Qvevri wines, then and now with Carla Capalbo. Um, the Circle has 270 plus members and was formed in 1960 in the UK, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators.
Mhm.
The membership is now global with a split between 50-50 in the UK and 50% overseas. There's more information about the Circle of Wine Writers on the website and also details about how to join. I'd now like to hand over to our chairman, Meg Maker, who will introduce our speaker today. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you, Andrea. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see smiling faces in the Hollywood squares of Zoom. I was the one who thought that Carla would be a great speaker because Carla is an expert in the wines of Georgia and Georgian cuisine and culture. And I met her first in 2019 in Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, and she impressed me with her tremendous depth of knowledge and understanding. And so I thought it would be really great to have her on to talk about not only the history of Georgia and Georgian wines, but also what's happening now in Georgia given the unrest, the civil unrest. So Carla is a fellow Circle member. She is, in addition to being a food and wine writer, she's also an expert photographer. She was based in Italy for 25 years and is now living in London. She has authored three regional guides to Italy's food and wine, Tuscany in 1998, Campania in 2006, and Collio in 2010. And that book won the Andre Simon Best Wine Book Award. Later, she visited Georgia extensively over the course of 3 years, and she published in 2017 a significant book, Tasting Georgia, A Food and Wine Journey in the Caucasus. And Tasting Georgia has won several awards, including the Guild of Food Writers Food and Travel Award. And it's been ranked one of the 6 best travel books of the last decade by Newsweek. So Carla will discuss Georgia's long winemaking traditions and then share her own thoughts and perceptions about what's going on with the industry today. So without further ado, welcome, Carla. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Meg and Andrea, and all of the members. Nice to see some familiar faces and some that are less familiar. So what I thought would be interesting, since the Qvevri, so the big clay pots are called Qvevri, and it's the oldest winemaking tradition that on record, dating back at least 8,000 years, perhaps much, much longer than that. And I thought it would be interesting to actually look at what these objects are, how they're made, how they're used. There's a lot of sort of mystique about them, and a lot of misconceptions about them as well. And sort of place them at the center of the culture, really, of wine and food in Georgia. I went to Georgia first, as Meg was saying, in I think 2013, or 12 or 13, and I really thought I was just going for, a week wine tour. And within about 3 days, I absolutely not only fell in love with the countryside, and the people and the wine and the food, but looking out of the window of the coach that was driving us from east to west and back again, visiting these small family winemakers, I'd become so used to kind of reading the landscape in Italy, all the years, over 20 years of driving around Italy by myself, up and down, visiting winemakers and food makers. And I could see that Georgia had retained something that we've lost. And that was really what made me decide, in a kind of mad whim, really, that somebody should write a great book about Georgia, and maybe it should be me. And luckily, my friends in Georgia, when I sort of proposed this, instead of saying, "You're mad, you don't speak a word of Georgian, you've only been here for 10 minutes, what are you talking about?" John Werdeman, who is from Pheasant's Tears, which is one of the famous wineries you may have heard of, said, "Actually, I love your books. If you wanted to come here and do a book here, I think it would really be a great thing, and we would help you." And then I panicked and said, "Oh, but wait, I don't speak Georgian, and I can't be independent the way I am in Italy, where I speak Italian, etc. And he said, don't worry, you know what your work is, and we'll just help you find those places and put somebody with you who can interpret for you. And that's what I did. So it was quite a complex journey, but also a very, very steep learning curve for me because I really didn't know much to begin with about it at all. But by the end, I really had learned a lot. So the Qvevri were what took me there in the first place. You know, when I wrote my book about the Collio, I met the extraordinary personage who is Josko Gravner. Of course, Michel, I know you know him, but maybe some of the rest of you do too. But anyway, he was is very unique, independent thinking, brilliant winemaker. And he was the first non-Georgian to give up using barrels and tanks and go back to what some people thought of as an extremely primitive winemaking method, which was in these clay pots, the Qvevri. And I first saw them up there when I was writing, you know, so about in 2007 or something, when I was starting work on my Collio book, and made great friends with him, and really responded to not only the wines being made in the Qvevri, but also the sort of energy that I felt was in the room when the Qvevri are in the room. You know, it's a very strange thing. You walk into a cellar, we're so used to going into cellars filled with barrels in Europe or America, you know, and you suddenly walk into what feels like an empty space or looks like an empty space with just these circles on the ground. I'll show you some pictures in a bit. And actually, I was overwhelmed by what I felt in that room. I actually was, you know, I sort of burst into tears. I was so moved by this sort of, you know, you could feel the power really of the wine that was there, even though you couldn't see it. And that was one of the reasons that I engineered a trip to Georgia. The other, this is the only personal thing I'll tell you, is that my mother, who was a ballet dancer, had danced with Balanchine in the New York City, the original New York City Ballet Company. And Balanchine, even though he was born in Russia, actually was Georgian and declared himself Georgian and always said he was Georgian and cooked like a Georgian and danced like a Georgian. And my mother before she died, went to Georgia so that she could see Balanchine's father's grave, because Balanchine's father was a very famous composer in Kutaisi in the western part near the Black Sea. And so when she came back, she said to me, you're going to have to go there. You'll love it. The food is incredible. And there are cows in all of the roads. And that was the bit. She knew me enough to know that that would be one of the things that would make me fall in love, is indeed because the animals are free in Georgia. They're not in jail, at least most of them. So let's get on with the Qvevri. We know that this tradition is this old because in archaeological digs, we've found, I say we, they have found, the Georgians have found traces, ceramic traces, which have the literally wine residue, tartaric wine residue on them. So they know that they weren't just being held to, made to hold juice. It was actually wine. And those date back to about 8,000 years ago. And indeed, the tradition may well be much, much older. And it's a tradition that can only be passed from, it's an unbroken tradition. That's the thing that is so important, because if the Qvevri making skipped a generation, there would be it would be lost, and it's one of the reasons that the Qvevri have become part of the UNESCO intangible patrimony. I always know these things in Italian, intangible patrimony, because it is something that can't really be taught except in that way. And so it's a tradition that, let's say, when the Soviet period, the very difficult Soviet period, was going on, the emphasis there, of course, was on quantity rather than quality. And so the Qvevri winemaking tradition was sort of snubbed and often disrespected because it was so, the Georgians, for the Georgians, it's so central to their own idea of themselves and their culture. And the Soviets did terrible things. You know, a lot of the wineries existed within monasteries and churches, and they would go and fill them with petrol, which killed, you know, it was like killing a creature to do that, because after that, a Qvevri would be no use at all. And if they're well kept, they can live for, you know, 300 years. There are some still being used today that are that old. And so there were extraordinary stories of people, you know, because somehow in the villages, it was much easier for each family to keep their 1 or 2 or 3 Qvevri. And in some cases, they literally, to get away from the Soviet threat, they would dig them up sort of in the middle of the night and take them off and hide them, you know, in the woods or something, so that they wouldn't be smashed or ruined. So this gives you an idea. It reminded me actually of when I was writing at one point about Emilia-Romagna, and I was writing about balsamic vinegar about 20 years ago, and I did a lot of research on it at the time. And I remember a story of a man who, when the bombing started, ran upstairs into the loft, which is where they kept the balsamic vinegar barrels, and took down the 2 smallest ones, which was as much as he could carry, and strapped them onto his bicycle and cycled away to try and save them, because it was like the family heirloom. And effectively, this is what the Qvevri are like. And so the tradition, you know, because the Eastern Orthodox religion, particularly in Georgia, sees wine as very much being a sort of symbol of the blood of Christ. It meant that the monasteries were places where the Qvevri were being used all the time. And so it left them open to persecution. So I think what we'll do is we'll look at now, if we can do the magical screen shift over here. I'm going to show you some pictures and talk through of sort of how they're made and what they are really. Let's see if this works. It should do. Okay, share. Okay, so here is, oops, I don't know how to do it. Can you see? Yeah, you can see the picture, I'm assuming. Yeah, good. So this Qvevri is finished. It's about to be put in the kiln, and this size would hold about 2,000 liters of wine. And this man, who is in Imereti, is one of the great masters. You know, at one time there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people able to make Qvevri throughout Georgia, where there are different sources of clay. And now it's down to about 10 to 15 people. So it's really a dying art, unless these people's children can be encouraged. And this is actually an excavation under one of the great monasteries, Gelati Monastery, just to show that, you know, even in the olden days, there they were. You can see they're sort of now being kind of kept. This is an extraordinary academy, from the Middle Ages, which was called Ikalto. And it was somewhere where young men came to learn about philosophy and religion, but also winemaking. And they had, these were their Qvevri. Now, the Qvevri, interestingly enough, are often kept outdoors. I've always been interested by this. And some of them still are today, as you'll see. But this is still from these remnants from this ancient, beautiful place. And this was also Ikalto. And by the way, these are all places you can visit. This would have been the place where the trough, where the grapes were crushed by foot. And then the wine would run off, the juice would run off. This is Alaverdi Monastery, which is one of the most famous and holy, and was one of the places where indeed they had a lot of terrible sabotage during the Soviet period. The other thing that happened, of course, during the Soviet period is that the areas like eastern Georgia, Kakheti, where there's this, the Alazani River Valley, which is a huge, immense river valley, just on the border with Azerbaijan and Dagestan over there. Very, very hot, very, very dry, almost desert-like. And that's where this Alaverdi is. And that's one of the areas where the grapes ripen so well in the summer that they can even do the whole bunch macerations with the stems, which in Europe is almost impossible because it would bring those sort of green notes. Whereas in Georgia, in the eastern part, it just adds a sort of tannic structure instead. It doesn't make that green side of it. Anyway, this was Alaverdi. So now I'm taking you to the potter's studio, which is so interesting. And the Qvevri are, they're pointed in the bottom. And so therefore, they're never intended to stand on their own tippy toe. They have to be buried in the ground. That's always the point. And the reason also that they're buried in the ground, there are many reasons, but one of them is that the Georgians say that the wine is brought up in the mother's embrace. And the mother, of course, is the earth that is holding the Qvevri. And it's quite a skillful job even to know how to bury them, because you have to protect against earthquakes and other such happenings. But anyway, this is so the very beginning of the Qvevri, the very base, the pointy bit, is actually the only part that's made on a wheel. That's that little thing. And then you see now they've started a few, and in the studio, indeed, they don't just make one and then make another. They bring every day, they work to, they're coil pots. So these are the sort of batons of clay, which they get very, very locally. And as the potter, the master craftsman, is working his way up, you can see he's adding maybe 2 to 3 inches a day. That's all they can do. And there isn't a thermometer in the place. There's nothing. There's no modern tools of any kind. It's just these beautiful arms and hands and eyes and the touch. And they have to calculate very carefully just each day, whether it's humid or dry, to how far they can go, because ultimately the weight of the Qvevri becomes an issue. So here he is again, Zaliko, with his son, and you can see that they've come up a little bit further, and then they put a little piece of tape around the top so it doesn't dry out too much. But each day they can go up, just a few inches until they get to a point where they're all, getting close to being ready. And then they put this sort of neck on the top. And then they stamp, each Qvevri producer stamps his own sort of whatever you name onto it. This is just a picture of another, just to give you an idea of a different style. This one is, whereas the first man that we were looking at, we're going back to him in a minute, he's in Imereti, which is sort of central western Georgia. This is eastern Georgia. This is the hot valley. And indeed, I always think it's like a clutch of eggs under a hen, because this basement here, this studio, father and son, as you can see, is under their house. They live upstairs. And this is their kiln, which is sort of out in their back garden for the smaller things. But now we're going back over to the original man, and this is his kiln, and it's basically an enormous room. These objects that you see in it at the moment, so the potters there, the Qvevri makers, make 2 distinct objects. They're both, though, made out of clay. One of them is the Qvevri, and this is called a tonne. And the tonne is the bread oven, which is the other, of course, the other critical thing that you need, bread and wine. And they're empty on the bottom. It's like a cylinder. And they place them once they've been fired, directly onto the ground. And then they light a fire on the ground inside. You see it, similar things in Turkey and other places. And they burn vine prunings, of course, and then the bread is stuck, sort of gets pasted onto the side, and they're very, very hot. And then they make these. So it's like a baguette, but it's a kind of semicircular baguette, and most delicious thing. And then, so what they do is that when they're firing the Qvevri, you see he's got these I-beams on the bottom here. That's so that he can, you'll see a picture in a minute, but you'll be able to understand it better. When it's all filled with Qvevri, they line the back wall first with the tonne, the bread ovens. Then they put in the Qvevri, because they're worth a great deal of money. And if you crack it, that's the end of it. And then they have another layer on the outside of the tonne, and then they brick it up. And so the only thing that is left open, so wait a sec, this is, now you can see that's more of those ovens, the bread ovens. Okay, wait. So here we go. So now he's pushing these long pieces of burning wood underneath, in between the I-beams that we saw a minute ago. And they have to keep the fire going for a week at the same temperature. I mean, it's an unbelievable skill. And he's such a character. He's an amazing guy. Anyway, you can see they're poking the long things, and then here is his family coming to the rescue, bringing the long sticks for them to burn. And he's the master, and he has to, keep making sure that the fire keeps going. And then when they take off well, this is before, but I mean, it works in reverse as well. They would then unseal the wall and take out the tonne, because the tonne are less, first of all, it doesn't matter as much if one of them cracks, and so they kind of protect the Qvevri on the inside. And then while the Qvevri are still hot, and I mean, really hot to the touch, they carefully bring them out, and he paints on the inside melted beeswax. And there's a lot of sort of misconception about this, because it's not to, it is and it isn't to seal it. It's a little bit like the ancient Egyptians in a way. They use the wax for the embalming. And in this case, the hot clay sort of absorbs, it sort of sucks into its inner pores the wax. And the idea is really to be able to help sterilize it. It's not so much to seal as it is to sterilize, because each year the Qvevri, if a Qvevri is being used, somebody with a narrow hips, once it's standing up in the ground, is lowered down into the big ones. These young lads go in and they scrape all around and clean, and so any kind of, if it was just on the surface of the inside of the clay pot, it wouldn't last a season. But in fact, it's gone further inside. And here we are at the next stage is the burying. And they dig an enormous hole, and then they have to, put gravel and stuff around so that if there is an earthquake, and indeed, look, here's one of the monks. So sort of touching, really. Working to, and that's Gela. The man in the hole is Gela, who's the other partner of Pheasant's Tears with John Werdeman. And then you see a cellar, when the Qvevri are indoors. This is a family cellar. Now, of course, this is the cellar of a very wonderful and famous and sort of pioneering winemaker called Iago Bitarishvili, whose wine is just called Iago, like Shakespeare. And he has recently added this sort of outer part, but all those circles each one is a buried Qvevri. And this picture is actually of one of my favorite cellars of all, because it's so organic, and you can just see that some of them are big and some are little, because again, it's like barrels. You have the sizes that you need. You have to keep them full. And so if you need to decant down to a smaller one, you do, and you're able to. And here you can see the big rocks that are sitting on top. If there's wine inside, they want to keep the wooden cover as firmly down as possible. But the other interesting thing about this photo is on the back wall, if you can see above the window, you see these very long sticks. And those were the ancient tools for working the Qvevri. And sometimes they're gourds that have been dried and then attached to a stick. And then there's a wonderful, I think I have a picture of it, a wonderful cleaner. Yeah, we'll see it in a minute, just a sec. So this is when we're in my 31. So once they're buried, here's a system whereby there's just a tiny little hole in the top, and he can put his pipette inside to extract enough wine, because the real thing is that you don't open your Qvevri very often. You might leave it. Here's Iago again, just taking out a little bit of wine for people to taste. Here's an earlier moment where you can see the wine is still sort of active, alive in there. This is in Imereti as well. I've always loved, like all these circles as well. There's Iago again, but you can see on the back wall a photograph, very old photograph of an earlier, somebody probably in the 19th century making Qvevri. But the interesting thing is also that the Qvevri sometimes are buried outdoors. And this is Ramaz Nikoladze, who's one of the great characters and makes, I think, some of the absolute best wines in Georgia. And, he opened this Qvevri for us. It was a group of people, and it's a big, big deal. It's like having a baby. You don't know what sex it's going to be. You don't know what's going to happen when you go inside there. And, he was pretty stressed, I can tell you. And it takes a while. You have to kind of chip away all the clay that you've put to kind of put this wooden center on top. And here he is, he's opened it up for the first time, because it'll have been closed for a year or 9 months or something. And he has no idea what's been going on down there. So it can really be quite an event, a celebration. And here he is this is Ramaz again in his other cellar, which he's, as these people have become popular. I mean, when I first met him, he was only making about 1,000 bottles a year. He had, 2/3 of a hectare. We think about all these people in Europe. They say, oh, I've got a small winery, I have 65 hectares. Well, in Georgia, it is not like that. These are people who really, really tend each vine themselves. And I should, of course, preface this whole thing by saying that I wrote my book about and am dedicated to the family, the small independent winemakers. This is an interesting fact, and it's recent, hot off the press yesterday, that the ocean, I don't have the exact figure, but it's just, millions and millions and millions of liters of wine that Georgia produces. Only 2% of that ocean is made by the small family winemakers like this, the Qvevri. I'm calling them the Qvevri winemakers. Sometimes they make some wines that are not in Qvevri, but mostly, and who have the philosophy of, basically organic or more work in the vineyards. And however, that 2% brings in 20% of the financial revenue from wine in Georgia. So it's unbelievably important, the work they're doing. They're the ambassadors, the cultural ambassadors. It's their wines that you'll find at Noma and, all the fancy restaurants. It's not the plonk, that they're selling for tuppence a liter to Russia that anybody's interested in. And I personally don't want to waste my time when I'm in Georgia. I have been to a couple of the big industrial places, and I thought, well, what's the point of this? I'm not interested in this. It's fine. Some of them are doing reasonable things, but they're doing them trying to kind of copy the style of Europe. And I don't personally think it's worth traveling all the way over there just for that. So I've just been quite clear about what my focus has been. So this is mama. Mama is the Georgian word for father, strangely enough. And this man was at Alaverdi Monastery. And what he's holding in his hands there is the cleaning tool for the Qvevri, and it's made out of layers of cherry bark, and it's sort of put on the stick, and that is a kind of rasp that they use for cleaning. And so when you're actually working your, you see she's also got the gourds in the back there. When you're working in your Qvevri, this is how you do it with the old sticks. And another interesting point for me anyway was that in the period that I was sort of chronicling, which was from about 2013 to 2017 when the book came, I was going 6, 7 times a year. When I started, there was only one woman who was signing her name to her wine. And she was, in fact, Marina. She was Iago's wife. And she's a very highly intelligent woman, highly intelligent man. But he was not showing her wine at the winery. If you went to, the Iago's winery, you didn't get Marina's wine until people, like me and a few others kept going, oh, I think Marina's wine is delicious, and all this. And now, of course, now it's Marina and Iago. There has been a switch. And Marina, was the first woman who put her name on her wine. And it was a fantastic inspiration to a lot of younger women. This woman, Mariam Yazebidze, who is now probably 30, but when I met her, she was 18 or something. She started making some wine too, in her grandmother's plot, and has become also a wonderful winemaker whose wines are being bought, by specialist buyers around the world. But before but luckily, since they're no longer having to scoop everything out with gourds, we do have modern things like pumps. And interestingly enough, also, sometimes you can buy the rights. If someone has abandoned their Qvevri, a village has been abandoned or a house has been abandoned and they don't want the Qvevri anymore and they're just sort of going there to rot, you can buy the rights to dig them up and replant them and use them again. And so this little group here were bought by Pheasant's Tears. John Werdeman bought them. Now, we haven't really talked about grape varieties, of which before the Soviet period, there were chronicled 525 native grape varieties, distinct grape varieties in Georgia. By the time the Soviets had finished with everything, they were really reducing everything down to 4 to 6 were the only ones that were actually being cultivated. Everything else was just kind of forgotten about. And it was kept going in little tiny villages. But what was exciting about the period that I was there was that there was this energy of optimism and looking forwards to a future that was about their own culture finally. And so a lot of young Georgians, like Georgi Natenadze, this is down in the south on the border with Armenia, were literally climbing vines and trees, go all the way up and getting the grapes and bringing them down. He went all the way up to the top and came down and brought me, and then they go and test the DNA and figure out, so this is the grape variety that was such and such. And he also did this thing of calling people up from other villages. I mean, he'd go somewhere, look up in a phone book and see a name that was from the South, because there was a big exodus from the South when there were all sorts of problems there with the Turks and everything. And he'd say, by any chance, when you left, did you take any grapevines with you? And they say, oh, yes, well, we have one growing up. He said, would you mind if I came over and did a test? And they found a whole load more. So they're back up to about 470 now. And some people are, trying to cultivate as many as they possibly can. This is sort of what it's like in the countryside there. This is Ramaz and his father harvesting. This is another young man, Zaza Gagua, who's over in the near the Black Sea, and he has done a lot of work over there. I have to go a bit faster now. This is the old system of, and still being used in some places, of the place for treading the grapes. These are the grapes being trod. I mean, I was just amazed to come across this. I couldn't believe that they in some remote little villages, they're still doing it the old-fashioned way. This is at Pheasant's Tears. You can see they put a piece of glass over the top of the fermenting grapes with Ricazzitelli, which is, of course, one of its most famous white varieties. And there they are doing the equivalent of the punch down. And here is another old character who was rather wonderful and dug up one in the garden and then brought it out. And, it's a ceremony. It's a big, big thing to bring out your wine. And look at the beauty of that. You sure don't need a stem glass to have this sort of honor of it all. And I couldn't not show you at least two pictures about food. So this is quite a common little outdoor structure. They'll make a kind of almost like a bamboo or cane woven room, and they put a fire in the middle, and the smoke kind of comes out. And they cook all sorts of things in there, including their type of polenta, which is called chomi. And everywhere I went, I was invited, of course, to a meal. This was a family, and I was there with my tripod and trying to I sort of started taking portraits of these supra tables. The supra is the feast, and this little boy snuck in and ended up in the picture too. And there's just one more of those. They're beautiful, one more beautiful than the other, with all the fermented vegetables. And of course, wine is just central. There's no such thing as eating. This is in the potter's studio with some fried potatoes, a cucumber, and a piece of bread. You never can get out without eating something. There's another one with the Qvevri, and they're the beautiful orange wines. And that's Iago saying goodbye. So, those are the pictures that I did want to show you. So what I also wanted to talk about was what's happening now, because of course, sadly, we're going into a very dark phase again after having been in the light for 20 years. And with all the enthusiasm around the world for these wines. In fact, this past weekend was a wine event that happens now every May called Zero Compromise. And it's for the natural wines, the Qvevri wines. And there were, hundreds of people coming from all over, including all around the world. There are more and more people coming to import Georgian wines of this type. But equally, we are on day 100 and I wrote it down. Today is day 159 of the protests that have happened every single day since last autumn. I was there for 3 weeks in December and went almost every night to the protests as well. To in a way, it was the only place you felt better. There's a lot of anxiety about, of course, Ukraine and Russia. I think that Georgia couldn't possibly fight in the way that Ukraine has if Russia suddenly decided that it was coming in and taking it. And of course, some of the people, the government, the so-called Georgian Dream government, has been in power now for a lot of years. And initially, they were very pro-democracy. This is what's been so confusing about it. But because of what's happened in Ukraine, there's been a shift in the government towards Russia, and the people are protesting because there were elections in October, November, and they were rigged. There was a lot of cheating going on, and people were intimidated and beaten up, and ballots were stuffed, etc. And so the population has come out on the streets. And if any of you have been to Tbilisi, there's the main drag in Tbilisi is called Rustaveli Avenue after the famous poet. And it's a beautiful, amazing, it's the most beautiful city anyway. And, the Grand Opera House is there, the parliament, all these different periods, the theater and so on, the museum, incredible museum. And every night for 159 days, the people of Tbilisi have come out of work and gone down and stood in the street. And it was freezing. It was way below zero when I was there in December. And so people were lighting bonfires in the rubbish bins and all that kind of thing, and singing a lot of things, very positive things, people shutting up their restaurants early and bringing out hot soup and whatever they could. And I wrote, a kind of daily diary about it on Instagram because I just thought, we have to kind of communicate this. But the real problem is that it isn't, I don't know, I guess it's doing something, but it isn't, I don't know we don't know what's going to happen. The government is more and more repressive. They're very angry at journalists. They're very angry at anybody who's trying to advocate for free speech and free, they're very down on gay people now. And not that they were ever really pro, but, there was a tolerance that is becoming less and less. And, it's very worrying, but the amazing spirit of the Georgian people is not surrendering to this, and I think that I was surprised, I thought, well, even if Russia invaded, I mean, the fact is that Russia already controls 20% of the land of Georgia in two chunks. And one chunk is only about a half an hour's drive from Tbilisi. They could be there in 1 minute. It's not it's tiny. It's the size of Scotland, the whole thing. We're not looking at another Ukraine. And so I thought to myself, well, I guess there couldn't really be any resistance. Well, I was wrong. A lot of people I talked to when I was there in December just said, well, if we have to, we'll die. If we have to, we'll fight. But I think that it's much more difficult for the older generation because they were born in the Soviet world and they lived through that, and having come out of it, they don't want to go back to it. So it's a very delicate moment. And of course the winemakers are terrifically worried. They're worried about tariffs, as everybody else in the world is at the moment. There's so many things being thrown at them, but nature has a way of calling you, and they're still in the vineyards working and looking. So far the harvest is, it's going well. Apparently there wasn't any freezing or anything terrible. And there's been much more because of climate change. There's been more hail in the last few years, particularly in Kakheti. Very bad, very, very bad. But Italy's had it too. I mean, it's not just there. But they have this wonderful will to keep going. So I'm hopeful. Now, I could keep going, but I think that does anybody have any questions?
Carla, thank you very much. I have heard about and read about and tasted some Georgian wines, but I had not seen the detail that you provided us, and that was so useful.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you. Terrific. And I have a couple questions. There's nothing really that surfaced in the chat, although Michelle Shaw has said she really, really, really loved going to Georgia. But so just sort of some practical questions about the Qvevri I understand that they need their coil pots, they need to be made, the bottom part needs to dry before you can add another kind of row before you finish it.
Well, it has to not dry, but it has to just take
harden, right?
It has to harden enough that the walls don't cave. Yeah.
So then how do they move this dry but unfired pot? How do they move that around and get it into the kiln? Like what?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not, we're not talking great distances, but they do it unbelievably carefully. They're only, even the big ones are only a couple of inches thick, the wall. They can't make that. And so, but if it's been made properly, it does hold together. And they wait until, in fact, the very first picture I showed you, the single Qvevri, the finished one, that was unfired, but they leave them, once they're done, they're left until they dry to the right amount to be able to then just taken over to the kiln.
Yeah. And they're fired only one time. That's correct.
They're fired once. That's right.
And so how so I think you spoke very touchingly about the opening of the Qvevri to share the wine with the guests. Does the wine get stored in the Qvevri? Do they bottle it? Do they put it in a smaller vessel? Like what happens after it's
I think
aged?
a bit all of the above. Some people leave their, I mean, there are a lot of different options really, just
Yeah.
like a barrel. You obviously, you need to keep them topped up. So
Yeah.
either you downscale them into smaller ones, or you can then take them and store them in tanks after they've done, they're sort of, because they both ferment in the Qvevri, but also they can age in the Qvevri, depending on how you want to do it. And the point about the pointed bottom is that the sediment as it comes down, if you have a flat bottom, like a steel tank normally is, you have this wide area of
Mhm.
contact between the sediment and or the lees or whatever and the liquid.
Mhm.
Whereas the Qvevri it's the smallest possible within that volume,
Right.
which is also, a sort of bonus of this system.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fascinating. And Michelle Padberg had some questions about size. Michelle, do you want to unmute and
Can't hear you yet.
yeah, she's working on it.
Sorry, trying to get my computer to do what I want. Yes, I was curious, how much wine do those large ones hold?
So the very large, like the one that the man was making at the beginning, is 2,000 liters. And then you can have many different sizes down from that. I think 2,000 is, I mean, there might be a few that are bigger, but I don't think you would have them more than 3,000. Maybe those big ones that were in the other man's house, like the eggs, that they may be a bit bigger, but around that size. And then there are many that are smaller.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So there's been some chatter here about can we have an AWE CWW trip to Georgia, please? But then Becky Sue Epstein asks, well, would media really even be welcomed now? Do you
Oh,
have a
sure.
sense?
No, they are. Of course they are. I mean, again, the circle, sorry, what am I saying? Zero Compromise, this event that just took place last weekend, was full of international people. And I think if you go along with an open mind and an open heart and don't cause massive ruptures, I mean, I don't know, so far so good. I know that, of course, the woman who runs one of the most important most outspoken voices in journalism against the regime, but she's Georgian. She's been having a lot of problems. But, I think if you're a foreigner, I don't think there's a problem. I really don't.
Yeah, if you're an American, they may not let you back in, but
Well, into what? Into America?
so then Angela Lloyd, Angela, I don't know if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah. Carla, I've asked whether we have two wineries in South Africa who have Qvevri from Georgia.
Really?
I wonder, yes. One is Kleinamuscale, that's Charles Beck, and the other one is Avondale in Parr, a guy called Jonathan, your surname misses me. But I wondered, is there more demand for them globally? And can the producers make enough to keep up with that demand?
A very good question. Very good question. Indeed, right around the time that I was writing my book, when more and more people were suddenly discovering it, and certainly here, the natural wine movement has completely, become a thing. It isn't just a fringe anymore. It's a serious and lasting thing. A lot of winemakers from around the world started traveling to Georgia, and then they wanted Qvevri too. And many have bought them, and it's encouraged some of the Qvevri making families to continue and to, keep, to keep their production up. But of course, the prices have gone way up, which has been a bit of a problem for some of the the Georgians never have any money. And so it's something that might be affordable to a European or a South African may well not be. I'm sure the Georgians don't pay the same amount, but still, I think there is an issue about that.
That's fascinating.
But I think, I think there's no, you see them now, I mean, I remember there was a project that I got involved with right at the beginning when it was happening in Emilia-Romagna. There was a group of producers who, as a kind of joint, about, I forget how many, 6 or 7 of them, did a project with the Georgians and brought in a bunch of, they did one truckload of Qvevri, and they each took one and did a sort of sample. That was interesting. The other interesting thing I didn't mention was that one of the ways, right at the beginning, one of the ways that the Qvevri tradition actually got saved was thanks to slow food. And slow food, as some of you will certainly know, was, started in Italy. It's really an Italian movement, although it's become global. One part of it has become global in the last 20 years or so. But it was really thanks to 2 producers in Georgia, Ramaz, and another guy whose name I know, but I've just forgotten for a second. And I remember, when I was living in Italy, I was quite closely involved with slow food for a long time and always went to their, events, wherever they were, whatever they were. And I remember going to one in France, actually, and suddenly somebody said, "Oh, guess what? There are Georgians here." I wouldn't know, but I hadn't been there by then. This was much earlier. And, there were these 2 guys with beards, couldn't speak a word of anything. And they didn't really have any wine. They just had a few old, terrible, out of focus pictures of their Qvevri behind them. But that was sort of the beginning. And actually, what happened as a result of that was that slow food, it was actually a Japanese woman who was involved with slow food, went to visit Ramaz and discovered really what the Qvevri situation was, and got back in touch with Carlo Petrini and said, "Look, this is incredible. We should try and make this one of our endangered projects to save." And in order for them to be able to do that, they had to, in each of the 2 areas, the East and the West, they had to have several people not only making wine in Qvevri, but also bottling their wines, which most people in Georgia never, ever had done before. So the bottling was a big obstacle. It's expensive. They didn't have the tools. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't know what to do. And so Ramaz kept, he's a major character, and he held these sort of, tastings in the town hall, and then he'd go around to everybody's farm and, make sure that they were really not putting any chemicals on their vineyards and so on. And then he would encourage them to bottle. And by the end of this period, and his friend whose name Soliko, that's right, Soliko Tsaishvili, who was in the east, in that very hot valley, did the same over there. And by the end, they had a dozen or 15 or whatever they needed, the kind of, the lowest number they could have in order to be accepted onto this slow food sort of endangered project. Well, I can't remember now the name of what that was, but anyway, and that was one of the things that then helped the Qvevri get into the UNESCO world. So, it's these sort of strange happenings and meetings that have really, it's real people that we know who have done this.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's great. There's two more questions, I think.
Sure.
Michelle Shaw, you had a couple questions about moving toward barrel.
Yeah, thank you, Meg and Carla. That was super. Really took me back to Georgia, and as I said, I loved that press trip that I did. It was fascinating. I had the impression whilst I was there that a lot of producers were moving away from the traditional Qvevri to barrels, wooden vessels, whether they be larger or smaller. Is this your impression?
Well, okay, it depends who you went to see, because I mean, I have to go back to my preface at the beginning. So certainly The bigger producers are doing that because they were never interested in the Qvevri to begin with. And many of them only put Qvevri in as a kind of, when they, there was a lot of hostility towards the Qvevri makers, the Qvevri winemakers. And I remember when I was living in Bordeaux and I happened to be at a tasting at, Pichon Longueville, I remember very well. And suddenly someone said to me, oh, it was during the Primeur week or something. And somebody said, oh, Carla, guess what? There's a Georgian down at the other end of by then I think I'd written my book. I said, a Georgian, I rushed over, I was all excited. And it turned out the man was someone who ran one of the bigger industrial wineries. And at first he was all smiles and darling. And then he said, oh, wait, who do you know? Oh, Ramaz. Oh, Pheasant's Tears. Oh, and then by the end of it, he left without saying goodbye, which I can tell you from a Georgian is a very bad thing to do because they're furious. They were so pissed off that these little tiny guys who were making, 700 bottles of wine, that the wine was being, lauded in all of the great restaurants around the world. And their wine, which they were making, 1 million bottles of, nobody really took any notice of. And so I have never myself been in any winery in Georgia. There are people who maybe go from Qvevri to steel tank or just stay in steel tank, but I've never ever seen a wooden barrel in any cellar that I've ever been to on the sort of smaller scale. I just have never seen one.
Yeah.
I mean, there might be one, just somebody's trying, but no, there's no, because the whole beauty, I think, of these wines is that there isn't any wood. Finally, we're free of wood. And once you get free of wood, you can't go back. You just taste the carpentry. It's so interesting. It's completely changed the way I even approach wine or what I want to drink anymore. I mean, okay, sure, there are some very good wines with wood, but I'm less and less into them.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Heather, you had a question, and I know, Becky, you had a list of questions that were there. I think we're going to have to be brief. We have about 3 minutes left, but you want to go, Heather, and then maybe Becky, we could end with you.
Yes, thank you. Carla, you're such a great natural storyteller. But my question is about amphora and whether you really see a difference between the use of amphora, which is becoming more and more prevalent in other parts of Europe, and this Qvevri, in terms of both technically, is it the same, but also culturally, it feels like it's a very different, unique thing.
Well, the origin of the amphora, at least from the kind of Roman, Italian, that sort of end of the world, was that they were transport. They were made for transportation. They weren't made for vinification. And, they were for transporting liquids. It could have been oil or wine or other things. But now, of course, yes, there are a lot of people working with what you could call an amphora. Many of them are out of the ground, although some of them are buried too. And I think in the end, there probably isn't all that much difference. It's just that it depends a little bit on the structure, because definitely the Qvevri has to have that pointed bottom. It's the egg. It is the kind of movement within the egg that's important as well. So some of it is just a difference in naming. But, the traditions in Spain or the south of Italy or whatever are just different. But, there's still clay vessels and therefore, I think, interesting too. But I don't know what, I'm not sure what else I could say about that.
Thank you.
And Becky Sue?
Hey, Carla, good to see you.
Hi, Becky. Lovely to see you.
I was wondering who is drinking all the industrial wine made in Georgia? Is it the Georgians, or are they exporting to Russia, or what?
They're exporting all over the ex-Soviet bloc. This ex-Soviet countries. Listen, you find it in the supermarkets here too. And it's not that it's all bad. It's just that some of it might be perfectly drinkable. But is it unique? Is it something that talks of that place or that method or those grapes? Actually, there's what's it called? Tibilvino was doing a kind of it's like I always think of it like a sort of a junior orange wine, a kind of introduction to orange wine, which Marks and Spencers have been selling for less than 10 quid. It's not bad. You know, I've bought it occasionally, but does it speak to me of, you know, the real experience of these kind of energized, amazing wines when they're really good? They're not all really good, but when they're really good, no, it doesn't. So there are just millions and millions and millions of barrels of wine that are being sold. And they're two different things. That's what I think. I'm not really, you know, I know which ones I'm interested in more.
Yeah.
I guess, I mean, I imagine that some of it's coming to America too, isn't it?
A little.
Mm-hmm. And now it probably won't again, you know. Nothing foreign is ever coming to America.
Right. Well, Carla, thank you so much. And thank you for all the great questions and conversation. I think we could go on talking about this for another hour. And so there's so much to know and learn and understand. But thank you so much for your time and expertise again. And with that, I want to hand it over to Liz, who can tell us about our next talk.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's been great to see you all. And thanks for the, you know, getting over the glitches at the beginning. We had some technical issues, but we got over them, and hope to see you in the flesh soon.